In a world obsessed with appearances, a weathered farmer in mud-caked boots dared to enter the first-class lounge at Denver International Airport. Humiliated and thrown out as passengers mocked him, no one noticed the small note that fell from his worn straw hat. "I'll pay with my soul. Just let my granddaughter live." What they couldn't see was the private jet waiting for him on the tarmac, and the desperate race against time to save the only family he had left. This is the story of Edgar Mulberry, a man willing to sacrifice everything for a deaf 7-year-old girl fighting for her life in Seattle. It's about the ultimate gift that can't be bought with money, the redemption that comes too late, and how a heart full of regret becomes a heart full of love, in the most literal way imaginable. Some journeys begin where you least expect them, when the people who judged you discover who you really are. Follow our channel for more stories that will break your heart and heal it at the same time. Like and comment where you're watching from, and share if this touched your soul. New episodes every week that remind us appearances are never what they seem. The clock struck 5:42 a.m. when Edgar stepped into the main terminal of Denver International Airport. The cavernous space was already alive with the hum of early travelers, their rolling suitcases creating a symphony of wheels against polished floors. But Edgar moved like a ghost among them, a weathered specter from another time and place. He wore a faded cotton shirt that had seen too many washings, dusty jeans hanging loosely from his frame, and mud-caked boots that left small clumps of dried earth with each heavy step. The straw hat pulled low over his eyes was frayed at the edges, shaped by years of sun and sweat. His calloused hands clutched a stained manila envelope, the only thing still tethering him to this world. His granddaughter Ivy's medical report. 7 years old, born into silence, now suspended between life and death in a Seattle children's hospital. Final boarding call for Flight 1422 to Seattle, the announcement echoed through the terminal, barely registering in Edgar's consciousness as he trudged forward, the weight of his military-style rucksack pressing into his shoulders like the burden of his past. The first-class lounge seemed to freeze in time as Edgar approached the entrance. The attendant, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a crisp blue uniform, looked up from her computer and visibly startled. "May I help you, sir?" Her voice was professionally polite, but her eyes betrayed confusion as they darted from his mud-caked boots to his weathered face. Edgar's rough fingers fumbled with the ticket in his pocket. "Got a flight to catch," he mumbled, his voice like gravel underfoot. He slid the first-class boarding pass across the counter. The attendant's perfectly shaped eyebrows arched in surprise as she scanned the ticket. This appears to be in order. But sir, are you certain you're in the correct section?" Edgar just nodded once, the brim of his hat hiding the red-rimmed eyes that hadn't known proper sleep in days. As he shuffled into the lounge, the subtle background music seemed to fade away. A young blonde woman in designer clothes wrinkled her nose and whispered something to her companion. An executive in a tailored suit looked up from his laptop, his face twisting with disdain. "Looks like you lost your way from the barnyard, old man," the executive muttered, loud enough for others to hear. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Edgar found an empty seat near the window. From his vantage point, he could see the planes on the tarmac, massive metal birds preparing to take flight. Somewhere out there was his ticket to Ivy, his last chance. The murmurs around him grew louder. "What's that smell?" a woman in expensive perfume asked, fanning her hand in front of her face. "Smells like he rolled in hay before coming here," another replied. Edgar sat silently, clutching the envelope containing the doctor's final words. "Immediate family donor match required. Time is critical." A tall, impeccably dressed man in his 40s stood up suddenly, his face flushed with indignation. "This is unacceptable," he announced to no one in particular. "This man is clearly in the wrong place." He strode toward the counter, shooting Edgar a look of disgust. "He reeks of hay and God knows what else." The attendant, caught between protocol and pressure, approached Edgar nervously. "Sir, there seems to be some confusion." "Ain't no confusion," Edgar said quietly, pulling out his boarding pass again. "Got a seat. Number 3A. The tall man scoffed. "I don't care what piece of paper he has. This is a premium space and there are standards." He snapped his fingers at two security guards standing near the entrance. "This man is disrupting everyone's comfort." Edgar tried to speak, to explain about Ivy, about the red-eye flight he needed to catch, about the hospital waiting on the other side, but the words caught in his throat like barbed wire. The security guards approached, their faces professionally blank. "Sir, we'll need you to come with us. Please," Edgar managed to say, his voice breaking. "My granddaughter?" "Save it," the tall man interrupted. "We've all heard sob stories before." The guards each took one of Edgar's arms, lifting him from the seat with firm but controlled force. The envelope fell from his lap, spilling a child's drawing onto the floor. Stick figures holding hands, one small, one tall, surrounded by scribbly green grass and a yellow sun. Edgar didn't resist as they escorted him through the lounge, past the smirks and stares. As they passed through the exit gate, something fell from his straw hat and fluttered to the ground like an autumn leaf. A small piece of cloth, hand-stitched with trembling letters. "I'll pay with my soul. Just let my granddaughter live." An uncomfortable silence spread through the lounge. The blonde influencer who had been recording the scene for her social media lowered her phone slowly, her expression shifting from mockery to confusion. The tall man who had called security bent down to pick up the fallen note, his brow furrowing as he read the desperate plea. He looked up toward the exit, but Edgar had already disappeared down the corridor, swallowed by the anonymous stream of travelers. What none of them knew, not the sneering executive, not the disgusted woman, not the security guards who had just removed him, was that the man in the worn straw hat had a plane waiting for him on the tarmac. A plane that belonged to him. The faded name Mulberry Agricultural Innovations was barely visible on its tail, worn away like the owner himself, but the Cessna Citation X was fueled and ready, waiting for the man everyone had just humiliated to board and fly to his dying granddaughter. On the west side of Denver International Airport, away from the gleaming terminals and crowded gates, stood a private hangar marked only by a small weathered sign, Hangar 7. Inside, the sleek silhouette of a Cessna Citation X waited on the polished concrete floor, its engines already humming with quiet anticipation. The morning sun glinted off its freshly waxed exterior, catching the faded lettering of Mulberry Agricultural Innovations on its tail. Captain James Reynolds paced nervously outside the aircraft, checking his watch for the fourth time in 10 minutes. His uniform was immaculate. Crisp white shirt with captain's epaulets, perfectly creased navy pants and shoes polished to a mirror shine. The contrast between the pilot's appearance and the man he awaited could not have been more stark. "Where is he?" Reynolds muttered to himself, scanning the empty tarmac. The hospital had called 20 minutes ago with news about Ivy's condition. Critical. Deteriorating. Every minute counted. The hangar door opened with a metallic groan, and Edgar Mulberry stumbled in, still catching his breath. His straw hat was askew, and his eyes held a wild, desperate look, like a cornered animal searching for escape. The security guards had released him at the main terminal exit, leaving him to make his way to the private hangar on foot. "Mr. Mulberry." Reynolds sprinted down the aircraft stairs, his formal composure breaking. "The hospital called. Ivy's condition has worsened. They've moved her to intensive care." Edgar's weather-beaten face seemed to age 10 more years in that instant. He nodded silently, his hand instinctively reaching for the small notebook in his pocket. Ivy's drawing book, where she sketched the world she couldn't hear. The pages were filled with colorful images, birds in flight, trees bending in invisible winds, and people with exaggerated smiles, all experiencing sounds she had never known. "Let's go," Edgar finally said, his voice barely audible over the engine's quiet hum. As they boarded, Reynolds noticed Edgar's shoulders were shaking, not from cold, but from silent, suppressed sobs that the old man refused to release fully. The pilot pretended not to notice, maintaining the dignity that his employer desperately needed in this moment. Inside the luxuriously appointed cabin, all cream leather and polished walnut, Edgar collapsed into a seat, looking entirely out of place in his mud-stained clothes and work-worn hands. The irony wasn't lost on him. Rejected from the airport's first-class lounge, only to retreat to his private jet. But appearances had never mattered to Edgar Mulberry. Only the land, only family, and he had failed at the latter so catastrophically that the former no longer brought any joy. As the jet taxied toward the runway, Edgar gently opened Ivy's notebook. His rough fingers carefully turned pages filled with her colorful imagination, a world where silence was not a disability, but a different kind of perception. On the last page she had drawn before her collapse, there was a picture of a little girl holding hands with a tall figure wearing a straw hat. Between them grew a golden wheat field, stretching toward a sun that smiled down on them both. Meanwhile, back at the airport terminal, Crystal Lorraine, the young blonde influencer from the first-class lounge, was typing furiously on her phone. "OMG, guys, look at this. A hick farmer just tried to invade our first-class lounge today. Security had to drag him out." She attached the video she'd captured of Edgar being escorted away, his dignity in tatters, his desperation on display for her growing audience. The post went viral almost immediately, generating thousands of likes and mocking comments within minutes. "Farmers belong in fields, not first class," one commenter wrote. "Maybe he thought they served hay in there," joked another. But then something unexpected happened. A user named A Medical Miracle 23 zoomed in on a frame from the video, the moment when the small cloth note had fallen from Edgar's hat. The comment read simply, "What's this? Can anyone read what it says?" Someone enhanced the image further, making the handwritten words just barely legible. "I'll pay with my soul. Just let my granddaughter live." The tone of the comment shifted suddenly. "Wait, is this serious? What's the story here? Did we just mock a man rushing to a dying child?" Crystal's phone began to vibrate incessantly with notifications, but she was no longer looking at it. Instead, she stared out the terminal window, watching a private jet accelerate down the runway and lift gracefully into the morning sky. Something cold and uncomfortable settled in her stomach, a feeling she rarely experienced in her carefully curated life: shame. As the Citation X reached cruising altitude, Edgar closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. The memories came unbidden, like they always did in moments of quiet desperation. He saw himself 30 years younger, standing in the rain outside a small-town shelter, watching as his teenage daughter clutched her newborn baby, both of them shivering on the doorstep. "You've disgraced this family," he had told her, the words acid on his tongue even now. "You made your choice. Now live with it." Those were the last words he'd ever spoken to his daughter. 6 months later, she was found dead in a cheap motel room, an empty bottle of pills beside her. The baby, Ivy, had been placed in foster care, lost in the system. It had taken Edgar 6 years to find her again, 6 years of private investigators and legal battles, only to discover her by chance at a local farmer's market where she helped an elderly foster mother sell vegetables, the little deaf girl who carefully arranged tomatoes by color, unable to hear the customers' requests, but somehow understanding their needs, his granddaughter. By then, Ivy's congenital heart condition had worsened significantly. The guilt Edgar carried was a physical weight, crushing his chest with every breath. He had abandoned his only child in her hour of need. He would not make the same mistake with her daughter. The jet engines hummed steadily as they sped toward Seattle, toward Ivy, toward what Edgar knew might be a final goodbye, or a chance at redemption that would cost him everything. Seattle Children's Hospital stood like a sentinel against the gray Washington sky, its modern glass facade reflecting the restless clouds above. Inside room 307 of the cardiology wing, 7-year-old Ivy Mulberry fought for every breath. Her small chest rose and fell in labored rhythm, each breath a battle against the failing heart that had been defective since birth. The machines surrounding her bed created a technological cocoon, their constant beeping and whirring a symphony of sounds she had never heard. Nurse Helen Patel checked the monitors for the 3rd time in 15 minutes. 32 years in pediatric critical care had taught her to recognize when a child was slipping away. Ivy's numbers were dropping, slowly but steadily, like autumn leaves detaching from a tree one by one. Helen's experienced eyes moved from the monitor to the little girl's face. Even in unconsciousness, Ivy's features held a delicate beauty, light brown hair spread across the pillow like a halo, long eyelashes resting against pale cheeks that had once been full of color. "Hold on, sweetheart," Helen whispered, knowing Ivy couldn't hear her words, but hoping somehow the sentiment might reach her. "Your grandfather is coming." Helen had never met Edgar Mulberry, but she had heard his voice on the phone, rough with emotion, desperate with hope. She knew he had fought through legal battles to gain custody of this child. She knew he had sold nearly everything he owned to fund experimental treatments. And she knew that without a compatible donor for a heart valve transplant, all his efforts might be in vain. A young resident doctor entered the room, her white coat still crisp with newness, her face showing the strain of a 30-hour shift. Dr. Melissa Albright reviewed Ivy's chart with a furrowed brow. "Any change?" she asked, though the monitors told the story clearly enough. "Blood pressure's down another point," Helen replied softly. Oxygen saturation at 88%. Dr. Albright sighed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. We can't wait much longer. If Mr. Mulberry doesn't arrive soon, he'll be here, Helen interrupted with a certainty she didn't entirely feel. He promised. Outside the hospital room, life continued in its relentless fashion. Doctors rushed between patients, families huddled in waiting rooms, and the ever-present hospital intercom summoned staff to various emergencies. No one noticed when the elevator doors opened, and a disheveled man in a straw hat stepped onto the 7th floor, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion, his work-worn hands clutching a small backpack. Edgar Mulberry had not eaten since yesterday. He had not slept properly in days. The private jet had landed 30 minutes ago, and he had come straight from the tarmac, refusing even a moment's delay to clean himself up. Nothing mattered except reaching Ivy's side. At the nurse's station, Edgar cleared his throat. "Ivy Mulberry," he said, his voice cracking slightly on her name. "I'm her grandfather." The duty nurse looked up, taking in his appearance with a momentary flash of judgment before recognition dawned. "Mr. Mulberry, we've been expecting you." She rose immediately. "Follow me, please. Dr. Albright wants to speak with you urgently." Edgar followed, his mud-caked boots leaving faint traces on the polished floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if he were wading through the quicksand of his own guilt and fear. What if he was too late? What if she was already gone? What if, after all this time, he never got to hear her call him Grandpa? Dr. Albright met him in a small consultation room, her young face serious but kind. "Mr. Mulberry, thank you for coming so quickly. Ivy's condition has deteriorated faster than we anticipated. Her heart valve is failing, and we need to perform surgery immediately." Edgar nodded, unable to speak. "We've been searching for a compatible donor," Dr. Albright continued, "but Ivy's rare blood type and tissue markers have made it difficult." She paused, studying the old man's face. "We ran your blood work from the samples you sent. The results just came back. You're a 100% match, Mr. Mulberry." The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. Edgar gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means you could be her donor," Dr. Albright explained. "We would take a portion of your own heart valve tissue. It's a rare procedure, extremely risky for the donor, but—" "Do it," Edgar interrupted, his voice suddenly firm and clear. "Take whatever you need. I just want her to have a chance, to hear the wind someday, to know what music sounds like." Dr. Albright hesitated. "Mr. Mulberry, I need to be clear about the risks. This procedure could result in severe complications for you. There's even a significant risk of—" "I understand," Edgar said, cutting her off again. "I've lived my life already, Doctor. Some of it well, much of it poorly, but that little girl in there hasn't even had a chance to start hers." He removed his hat, revealing a full head of silver hair and eyes that held a lifetime of regret and determination. "I'll sign whatever you need me to sign." Before being prepped for pre-surgical tests, Edgar asked to see Ivy. The nurse led him to room 307, where the little girl lay surrounded by machines. Edgar approached slowly, almost reverently, as if afraid his rough presence might somehow disturb the fragile balance keeping her alive. At Ivy's bedside, he noticed she clutched a small notebook even in unconsciousness. Gently, he touched its edge, recognizing it as her drawing book. Inside were pages filled with colorful images, her way of communicating with a world she couldn't hear. The latest drawing showed a little girl standing beneath a tree, reaching up toward birds in flight. Edgar's throat tightened at the sight. She had never heard birdsong, yet she drew birds everywhere. "I'm here now, little one," he whispered, knowing she couldn't hear but needing to say the words aloud. "And I'm going to make sure you get the chance to hear those birds sing." As if sensing his presence, Ivy's eyelids fluttered slightly. For the briefest moment her eyes opened, deep brown eyes that mirrored his own, before closing again. But in that flash of connection, Edgar found the strength he would need for what lay ahead. He turned to Dr. Albright, who had followed him into the room. "I'm ready," he said simply. "Take what you need from me. I just want her to live." In that moment, Edgar Mulberry made a choice that would either redeem his past failures or become his final act on Earth. Either way, he knew with absolute certainty that it was the right thing to do. The hospital chapel stood silent and somber at 2:47 a.m., its stained glass windows dark, except for the soft glow of perpetually burning candles. Rain lashed against the windows, creating shadows that danced across the worn wooden pews. Edgar Mulberry sat alone in the front row, his weathered hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His straw hat rested on the bench beside him, revealing a head of silver hair that caught the candlelight like tarnished metal. The pre-surgery preparations would begin in 3 hours. The doctors had given Edgar time to get his affairs in order, a phrase that hung in the air like a death sentence. The experimental procedure, donating part of his heart valve tissue to save Ivy, carried significant risks, but Edgar hadn't hesitated for a moment, not when the stakes were his granddaughter's life. "I thought I might find you here," came a gentle voice from the doorway. Father Michael O'Brien, the elderly hospital chaplain, walked slowly down the aisle, his white collar stark against his black shirt. His face bore the gentle wrinkles of a man who had witnessed both profound sorrow and transcendent joy throughout his 60 years of ministry. "Mind if I join you?" Edgar nodded silently, sliding over to make room. The old priest sat down with a quiet groan, his arthritic knees protesting the movement. "I've been doing this job for 30 years, Father Michael said after a moment of shared silence. "And I've learned that when a man sits alone in a chapel at this hour, he's either searching for answers or gathering courage." "Maybe a bit of both," Edgar replied, his voice rough with emotion. His eyes remained fixed on the simple wooden cross at the altar. "Never been much for praying. Figure God's got more important things to worry about than an old fool like me." The chaplain smiled softly. "In my experience, God tends to have a special interest in old fools, particularly those sitting in chapels at 3 in the morning." A ghost of a smile tugged at Edgar's lips, then faded. Outside, thunder rolled across the Seattle sky, a distant drummer marking time. "Want to talk about it?" Father Michael asked, making no move to push or pry. Edgar was silent for so long that the priest thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words seemed to emerge from somewhere deep and wounded. "I was a coward," he said simply. "My daughter got pregnant at 15. Caroline, beautiful girl, smart as a whip, had her whole future ahead of her." He paused, swallowing hard. "When she told me, I lost my mind, told her she'd disgraced our family, told her to get out." His voice cracked on the last word. Father Michael nodded, his silence an invitation to continue. "She left that night, took nothing but the clothes on her back and the baby growing inside her." Edgar's eyes grew distant, seeing not the chapel but a rain-soaked country road 20 years in the past. "I never saw her again. 6 months later, they found her in some cheap motel room, empty bottle of pills beside her. The baby, Ivy, had been born a few weeks earlier, got put in the system." Lightning flashed, illuminating the stained glass momentarily, fragments of saints and angels watching over the confession unfolding below. "It took me 6 years to find her," Edgar continued. "Hired detectives, fought through red tape, and when I finally did," his voice trailed off, the pain too fresh despite the years. "She couldn't hear me, born deaf, and her heart, they said it was congenital, might have been caught earlier with proper care." Father Michael placed a weathered hand on Edgar's shoulder, but remained silent. "I found her by accident, you know," Edgar said, a bitter laugh escaping him. "After all that searching, all that money spent. I was at the local farmer's market back home in Montana. There was this little girl arranging tomatoes by color. So careful, so precise. Something about her eyes." He took a shuddering breath. Caroline's eyes. The silence that followed was filled with the steady drumming of rain against glass, nature's own requiem. "Her foster mom was selling vegetables. Sweet lady. When she told me the girl's name was Ivy, I nearly collapsed right there among the zucchini." Edgar rubbed a rough hand across his face. "I'd already lost my daughter. I wasn't about to lose her child too." Father Michael nodded slowly. "And so you became her guardian." Took another year of legal battles. By then, her heart condition was worse. Started selling off pieces of the farm to pay for treatments. Edgar's eyes hardened with determination. Worth every acre. Lightning flashed again, closer now, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that shook the chapel windows. "Do you know what haunts me most, Father?" Edgar asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not that Caroline's gone, not that Ivy might—" He couldn't complete the thought. "It's that my last words to my own daughter were spoken in anger. 'You made your choice,' I told her. 'Now live with it.'" His shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. "And she didn't. She didn't live with it at all." Father Michael waited patiently as Edgar composed himself, offering neither platitudes nor easy absolution. "That's why I have to do this," Edgar finally said, straightening his shoulders. "This surgery, If there's any chance it gives Ivy the life Caroline never had, you're willing to risk everything, Father Michael finished for him. Edgar nodded. I told the doctors not to list me as her grandfather on the paperwork. Didn't want her to know in case... He trailed off again. She deserves better than a grandfather who failed her mother. Outside the chapel window, dawn was beginning to break, pale light seeping through the rain clouds. Time was growing short. Would you like to pray together? Father Michael asked gently. Wouldn't know the words, Edgar admitted. The old priest smiled. Words aren't always necessary. Sometimes it's enough just to sit here together and hope. As they sat in silence, watching the growing light filter through the stained glass, something shifted in Edgar's heart. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps the first fragile seeds of peace. Whatever happened in the operating room later that day, he had made his choice. For once in his life, he would not run from the consequences. In the east wing of the hospital, miles of corridors away, Ivy Mulberry slept fitfully, her small chest rising and falling with each labored breath, unaware that the grandfather she barely knew was preparing to give her the most precious gift possible, a second chance at the life her mother had been denied. The operating room buzzed with the methodical efficiency of life and death routines. Machines hummed and beeped in their electronic language, monitoring every vital sign as nurses and surgical assistants moved with practiced precision, arranging instruments on metal trays that gleamed under the harsh overhead lights. The air smelled of antiseptic and anticipation, that peculiar hospital cocktail of hope and fear. Dr. Miranda Chen, the lead cardiac surgeon, studied the final preoperative scans on the monitor. Her reputation for groundbreaking pediatric cardiac procedures had brought her to Seattle Children's Hospital from Johns Hopkins 3 years ago. Today would test even her exceptional skills. It's unprecedented, she murmured to Dr. Albright, who stood beside her. Partial living donor heart valve transplant between non-parent and child. The genetic compatibility is remarkable, but the risks to the donor... He knows, Dr. Albright replied quietly. We went through everything, multiple times. He signed every waiver, every acknowledgement of risk. He's adamant. Dr. Chen nodded, her eyes still on the scans. Bring them in, she finally said. 2 separate teams wheeled in 2 gurneys. On one lay Ivy Mulberry, small and fragile, her breathing shallow beneath the blue surgical drape. On the other lay Edgar, his weathered face a map of determination and fear. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Marcus Winters, a veteran with salt and pepper hair and steady hands, leaned over Edgar. Count backward from 10, Mr. Mulberry. Edgar nodded slightly, but before he began counting, he reached for something clutched in his hand, a child's hospital bracelet, yellowed with age. The name Melody M was handwritten on it in faded ink. That's a keepsake, Mr. Mulberry, Dr. Winters asked, noticing how tightly Edgar held it. My daughter's, Edgar whispered, his voice already growing distant as the drugs entered his system. From when she was born. Melody Mulberry, Ivy's mother. Doctor. Winters nodded, a practiced bedside compassion in his eyes. Would you like us to keep it safe for you during surgery? Edgar shook his head weakly. Need to keep it close. Need to tell her, I'm sorry. Nurse Sophia Rodriguez, who had been preparing Edgar's chest for the incision, noticed the exchange. Was that your daughter, Mr. Mulberry? She asked gently, her voice soft with genuine care. Edgar's eyes were growing heavy, but he managed to nod. She died, believing no one loved her. A single tear escaped, trailing down his weathered cheek. But Ivy can still know the truth. His words slurred as the anesthesia took hold, but their impact lingered in the suddenly quiet operating room. The medical team exchanged glances, a brief, unspoken acknowledgement of the human story beneath the clinical procedure they were about to perform. As Edgar drifted into unconsciousness, Dr. Chen cleared her throat. Let's begin. We have 2 lives to save today. Outside in the waiting area, the scene was unfolding in unexpected ways. Crystal Lorraine, the influencer whose viral video had humiliated Edgar at the airport, had arrived at the hospital. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup, a stark contrast to her carefully curated social media persona. She had come to film an apology, a gesture calculated to mitigate the backlash her original post had received after followers discovered the truth about Edgar's situation. But as she entered the hospital, something shifted in her. This wasn't content. This was a human life. And when she overheard a nurse discussing the rare procedure taking place, her curiosity led her to linger near the surgical floor's information desk. "Excuse me," she asked the clerk, attempting to look like she belonged there. "I'm looking for information about Edgar Mulberry. He's my uncle." The clerk looked at her skeptically but checked the computer. "He's in surgery now. Are you on the approved family list?" Crystal shook her head, but her eyes caught a glimpse of the screen over the clerk's shoulder. The words, "Cardiac tissue donation in vivo, pediatric emergency," stood out starkly on the monitor. Her practiced social media smile faltered. "Is he donating his heart? Is that even possible?" The clerk frowned, turning the screen away. "I can't discuss patient information. You should wait for the surgical team to provide updates." Crystal stepped back, her mind racing. She found a quiet corner of the waiting room and pulled out her phone, but instead of opening her social media apps, she searched for information about living cardiac tissue donation. What she found made her stomach drop. Meanwhile, in the operating room, the procedure had begun. Dr. Chen worked with exceptional focus, her hands steady as she made the first incision into Edgar's chest. The monitoring equipment beeped steadily, tracking every vital sign as they moved deeper toward his heart. Across the room, a second team prepared Ivy for her part of the procedure, the little girl's tiny body dwarfed by the equipment surrounding her. Her long eyelashes rested against her pale cheeks, her expression peaceful despite the critical situation. As Dr. Chen reached Edgar's heart and began the delicate process of accessing the valve tissue they would transplant, she paused momentarily. "Remarkable," she murmured. "Despite his age and the stress he's clearly been under, his heart tissue is exceptionally strong." Dr. Albright, assisting with the procedure, nodded. "Farming life. Physical labor well into his 70s, according to his records. A strong heart in more ways than one," Dr. Chen replied quietly. The surgery progressed with the intensity of high-stakes precision work. Every cut, every suture was performed with exacting care. The room was silent, except for the medical team's brief technical exchanges and the steady beeping of monitors. 3 hours in, as they prepared to transfer the living tissue from Edgar to Ivy, the tension peaked. This was the moment where both patients were most vulnerable, a dangerous tightrope of timing and technique. "Beginning extraction," Dr. Chen announced, her voice steady despite the pressure. In that critical moment, Edgar's vital signs wavered slightly. The anesthesiologist leaned forward, adjusting something on his equipment. Pressure dropping. "Nothing critical yet, but we're watching it." A nurse wiped Dr. Chen's brow as she continued working. "Extraction complete. Beginning transfer." The tissue, a living part of Edgar's heart, was carefully moved to the table where Ivy lay waiting. The second surgical team took over, working quickly to integrate the donated tissue into the little girl's failing heart. Every second mattered now. Outside in the waiting room, Crystal had abandoned all pretense of creating content. Instead, she sat with her head bowed, her phone dark in her lap. Nearby, hospital staff whispered among themselves about the unusual procedure taking place. "They say he's the grandfather," one nurse murmured to another, giving part of his own heart to save her. "I heard he's not even listed as family on her paperwork," the other replied, "just as donor." Crystal looked up, catching the exchange. The contrast between the man she had mocked for internet fame and the man sacrificing himself for a child struck her with the force of physical pain. In the operating room, the procedure entered its final phase. The donated tissue was in place in Ivy's heart, and Dr. Chen was now working to repair Edgar's. The monitors showed both patients stable but fragile, teetering on the edge of what medicine could accomplish. "Close him up," Dr. Chen finally said, stepping back from Edgar's table. "I need to check the integration on the recipient." As they began suturing Edgar's chest closed, Nurse Rodriguez noticed that his hand had reflexively tightened around the old hospital bracelet. She gently pried his fingers open enough to prevent it from being crushed, but left it in his palm where he'd wanted it to remain. "Melody M," she read again, wonder in her voice at the story this simple bracelet contained. A child lost, a father's regret, and now perhaps a chance at redemption through the next generation. The bracelet's presence in the operating room seemed to bear silent witness to a family's broken history, and the desperate, brave attempt to rewrite its ending with a sacrifice that would either heal two hearts at once or break them both forever. The hours of the surgery dragged like centuries, each minute marked by the methodical beeping of monitors and the hushed voices of the medical team. Outside the operating room, the hospital continued its endless rhythm, life and death, joy and sorrow, all existing simultaneously under one roof. In the waiting area, Crystal Lorraine sat alone, her designer handbag discarded carelessly on the chair beside her. Her phone, usually an extension of her hand, remained untouched in her pocket. For once in her adult life, she wasn't documenting the moment. She was simply present in it, feeling the weight of something genuine and raw. A local news reporter approached, microphone in hand, cameraman trailing behind. "Excuse me, we're covering the story about the farmer and his granddaughter. I understand you were there at the airport when—" "No," Crystal said firmly, rising to block their path to the surgical floor. Her voice, normally calibrated for maximum engagement, now carried a steel she didn't recognize. "No cameras, no story. This isn't content. This is someone's life." The reporter persisted. "But the public interest, he deserves privacy," Crystal interrupted, her perfectly manicured hand gripping the reporter's forearm with surprising strength, "and dignity. He deserves silence." The reporter looked startled, then nodded slowly, lowering her microphone. Something in Crystal's eyes, perhaps the reflection of her own shame, made further argument impossible. Inside the operating room, the tension had reached its peak. Dr. Chen worked methodically, her hands moving with the precision of a master pianist, each gesture precise and deliberate. Edgar's vital signs had stabilized after the tissue extraction, but he wasn't out of danger. His age made the procedure exponentially riskier. "BP holding at 110/70, the anesthesiologist reported, his voice carrying the controlled calm of someone walking a tightrope, remarkably strong for his condition. Across the room, Dr. Albright was closing Ivy's small chest, the transplanted valve tissue successfully integrated into her heart. The team held its collective breath as they watched the monitors, waiting for the first signs of rejection or acceptance. "Preliminary indications positive," Dr. Albright said, a hint of cautious hope in her voice. "Her heart is accepting the tissue." A collective exhalation seemed to move through the room. The first hurdle had been cleared, but many remained ahead. As the nurses prepared to transfer both patients to recovery, one of them found a folded piece of paper that had fallen from Edgar's clothing during the surgical prep. Attached to it was the stitched cloth note that had fallen from his hat at the airport. "I'll pay with my soul, just let my granddaughter live." The nurse hesitated, then handed both to the head surgical nurse. "Should we put this with his personal effects?" The head nurse unfolded the paper gently. It was a letter, handwritten in a shaky but determined hand. "To whom it may concern, they took away my seat in first class, but give her the chance to take any seat in this world. If you're reading this, I've made my choice. Maybe the only right choice I've ever made. I don't need gratitude or recognition. I need Ivy to have what her mother never did, a chance. Tell her, when she's old enough to understand, that her grandfather loved her. That he was flawed and broken, but in the end he tried to make things right. And if there's any mercy in this world, tell her I'm sorry I couldn't be better for her mother. Tell her I hope to be better for her. Edgar Mulberry." The head nurse carefully refolded the letter, her professional composure momentarily cracked by the raw emotion of those words. She placed the letter and the stitched note in the sealed bag with Edgar's personal belongings, her hands moving with the reverence one might show a sacred text. "Yes," she said quietly, "keep these safe. They're more important than you know." The recovery room was dimly lit, a liminal space between surgery and awakening. Edgar and Ivy had been placed in separate areas, each surrounded by monitoring equipment and attended by vigilant nurses. The regular beeping of the machines created a counterpoint rhythm, like two hearts trying to synchronize across space. Hours passed. The hospital shifted from day to night. Doctors came and went, checking vitals, making notes, adjusting medications. Through it all, neither patient stirred. In the small waiting area reserved for family, Crystal had refused to leave. Though she had no official status, one of the nurses had taken pity on her evident distress and allowed her to stay, bending rules in recognition of the strange circumstances. "I don't understand," Crystal whispered to no one in particular, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. "I don't understand how someone who had nothing could give everything." Outside, Seattle's persistent rain had returned, drops streaking the glass like tears. The world beyond the hospital continued, oblivious to the drama unfolding within. Cars honking, people rushing to dinner reservations, tourists seeking shelter from the downpour. None of them knew about the farmer who had offered part of his heart to save a child, or the influencer whose carefully constructed world was crumbling in the face of genuine sacrifice. Just before midnight, Dr. Chen appeared in the waiting area, still in her surgical scrubs. Her face showed the exhaustion of hours of intense concentration, but her eyes held a cautious optimism. "The surgery was successful," she said simply. "Both patients are stable for now, though the next 48 hours will be critical." Crystal looked up, her face showing naked hope. "So they'll both be okay?" Dr. Chen's expression became guarded. "The child's prognosis is good. Her body is accepting the transplanted tissue remarkably well." She hesitated. "Mr. Mulberry's situation is more complex. The procedure placed significant stress on his system. We're monitoring him closely. But he'll recover," Crystal pressed. "We're doing everything we can," Dr. Chen replied, the standard medical non-answer that carried volumes of unspoken concern. As Crystal absorbed this, a nurse approached Dr. Chen with a tablet. "Doctor, there's something unusual in the donor's post-operative blood work. You should see this." Dr. Chen frowned, studying the screen. "That's unexpected." "Run it again to confirm." The subtle shift in her expression told Crystal all she needed to know. Something was wrong, something beyond the normal risks of the procedure. After the doctor left, Crystal found herself drawn to the small chapel near the surgical floor. Unlike Edgar, she hadn't prayed since childhood, hadn't even thought about faith or greater purpose beyond her next post or sponsorship deal. But tonight, something pulled her to that quiet space. The chapel was empty except for the flickering light of candles. Crystal sat in the front pew, her designer clothes incongruous in the simple, sacred space. She didn't know the right words or gestures, so she simply sat in silence, feeling the weight of witnessing something that had irrevocably changed her. "I don't know if anyone's listening," she finally whispered, her voice small in the quiet room. "But if you are, he deserves to live. More than me, more than most of us. He's the real thing in a world full of fakes." She paused, a tear tracking down her cheek. "And I'd give anything to tell him I'm sorry." Outside the chapel, in the recovery room, Edgar Mulberry's hand twitched slightly, the old hospital bracelet still clutched in his fingers. His eyes remained closed, his breathing shallow but steady. Inside him, a heart now missing a piece continued its resolute beating. A farmer's heart rooted to the earth, stubbornly refusing to surrender to the surgical trauma it had endured. And across the hospital, a little girl's heart, now containing a piece of her grandfather, beat stronger than it ever had before. 2 generations joined in the most literal and profound way possible. Days passed like whispers in the pediatric recovery wing of Seattle Children's Hospital. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant tune, while outside the windows, Seattle's skyline disappeared and reappeared through shifting curtains of rain and fog. Time in hospitals has its own peculiar rhythm, measured not in hours and minutes, but in medication schedules, shift changes, and the slow, arduous journey from crisis to recovery. On the 4th morning after the surgery, as pale sunlight filtered through the blinds of room 418, Ivy Mulberry's eyelids fluttered open. Her small body was still connected to a network of tubes and wires, each one monitoring or supporting some vital function. The room around her was painted in cheerful yellows and blues, with cartoon animals dancing across the walls, a desperate attempt to inject childhood joy into a place of clinical necessity. Nurse Helen Patel was checking Ivy's vitals when she noticed the change. The little girl's deep brown eyes, so like her mother's and grandfather's, were open and alert, focusing with surprising clarity on Helen's face. "Well, hello there, sleepyhead," Helen said with a warm smile, signing the words simultaneously with practiced hands. She had been learning American Sign Language specifically for Ivy during her weeks at the hospital. "You've had quite the adventure." Ivy's hands moved weakly in response, forming simple signs. "Hurt. Chest." "Where?" "You're in the hospital," Helen signed back, speaking aloud as well. "The doctors fixed your heart. You're going to be okay now." A flicker of memory seemed to pass across Ivy's face. Her small fingers reached toward her chest, where beneath the bandages a piece of her grandfather's heart now beat within her own. Helen gently caught her hand before she could touch the incision site. "Careful, sweetheart. That needs time to heal, doctor." Albright entered the room, her white coat crisp, her expression brightening when she saw Ivy awake. "Look who's back with us," she said, approaching the bed. She too signed as she spoke, though her movements were less fluid than Helen's. How are you feeling, Ivy? The little girl's hands formed the sign for thirsty, and Helen immediately reached for a small cup with a straw. Dr. Albright checked Ivy's vitals, nodding with satisfaction at what she saw on the monitors. Everything looks excellent. Your new heart valve is working beautifully. As Ivy took small sips of water, her eyes darted around the room, clearly searching for someone. Her hands formed a question. Grandpa? Helen and Dr. Albright exchanged a quick glance, a silent communication that contained volumes. What does she know? How much should we tell her? Your grandfather is resting in another room, Dr. Albright signed carefully. He's been very worried about you. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. Down the hall in the adult intensive care unit, Edgar Mulberry remained unconscious. His body, weathered by decades of hard labor and recent stress, was struggling to recover from the surgery. The doctors weren't certain if he would ever wake up. Ivy seemed to sense the omission. Her intelligent eyes narrowed slightly, and she signed, "Want to see him." "Soon," Helen promised, her hands gentle but firm in their response. "When you're both stronger." Later that afternoon, as Ivy rested, Helen stepped into the hallway where she found Crystal lingering near the nurse's station. The young woman's appearance had transformed over the past 4 days. Her carefully styled hair was now pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup, her designer clothes replaced by jeans and a plain sweater. "How is she?" Crystal asked, her voice hushed with genuine concern. "Awake, alert, asking for her grandfather," Helen replied, adjusting her surgical mask. Crystal's expression fell. "And Mr. Mulberry?" Helen shook her head slightly. "No change. Dr. Chen is concerned about the prolonged unconsciousness." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the hospital, call buttons, intercoms, the squeaking of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. "There's something else you should know," Helen said after a moment. "We found a recording in Mr. Mulberry's personal effects. A voice message for Ivy. He must have made it before the surgery, just in case." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both understood what Edgar had prepared for. 2 days later, when Ivy was strong enough to sit up in bed, Helen brought in a small digital recorder. The little girl's eyes widened with curiosity as the nurse placed it on the rolling table beside her. "Your grandfather left a message for you," Helen signed, her movements gentle. "Would you like to hear it?" Ivy looked confused, her hands forming the obvious question, "Here." Helen smiled and reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, advanced hearing aid. "The doctors believe that with your heart fixed, you're strong enough for this now. It won't give you perfect hearing, but it might let you hear some sounds, maybe even voices. Would you like to try?" Wonderment spread across Ivy's face. She nodded eagerly, her small hands trembling with excitement. With careful movements, Helen fitted the device into Ivy's ear, then turned it on, adjusting the settings as the audiologist had instructed. Ivy's eyes widened, her entire body tensing as sound, perhaps the first clear sound she had ever experienced, entered her awareness. "Can you hear me?" Helen asked softly, not signing this time. Ivy's expression was a mixture of shock and wonder, tears welling in her eyes as she nodded slowly. The sensation of sound, the mysterious experience she had only imagined through vibrations and visual cues, was overwhelming. Her small hand clutched Helen's, seeking anchor in this new, expanded world. "Are you ready for your grandfather's message?" Helen asked, both speaking and signing now, helping Ivy bridge the gap between her silent world and this new auditory experience. Ivy nodded, her eyes fixed on the recorder, with an intensity that seemed to hold her entire being. Helen pressed play, and Edgar's rough, warm voice filled the small room. "Hi, flower girl," Ivy gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. This was her grandfather's voice, a sound she had never heard, but somehow recognized in the deepest part of herself. "If you're listening to this," Edgar's recording continued, "it means the doctors found a way to help you hear. And maybe it means I'm not there to tell you myself how much I love you." Tears streamed down Ivy's face now, matching those that silently traced paths down Helen's cheeks. "I want you to know," Edgar's voice continued, steady despite the emotion behind his words, "that you are the bravest, strongest person I've ever known. And I want you to know about your mom, my daughter Melody." The recording continued for several minutes, Edgar's voice painting pictures of Ivy's mother, her laugh, her love of drawing, how she could name every star in the sky. He spoke of regrets and mistakes, of lost chances and new beginnings. And finally his voice grew softer, more intimate. Even if I can't see you grow up, I want you to know you are loved. And even if you can't hear me, I want you to feel it. My heart now beats inside you. When the recording ended, the room fell into a silence that felt both empty and full. Ivy sat perfectly still, her eyes closed, as if trying to absorb every echo of her grandfather's voice that might linger in the air. "There's more," Helen said gently, drawing Ivy's attention back to the present. "Your grandfather left this letter for you to read when you're older." She placed the sealed envelope on the table beside the recorder. Ivy reached for it with reverent fingers, tracing the outline of her name written in Edgar's sturdy, slightly shaky handwriting. Across the hospital, in the adult ICU, Edgar Mulberry lay still, his weather-beaten face peaceful in unconsciousness. The monitors beside him beeped steadily, telling the story of a heart that continued to fight despite everything it had endured. On the small table beside his bed sat his straw hat, waiting for its owner to reclaim it and step back into the sunlight. What neither Ivy nor the hospital staff yet knew was that within the envelope, alongside Edgar's letter, was a deed to 500 acres of prime Montana farmland, the last of Edgar's holdings, now signed over to his granddaughter. Not as inheritance after death, but as a gift of life, a place to call home when she was ready, a place where the wind sang through wheat fields and birds called from fence posts, a place where someday she would finally be able to hear the sounds that had always surrounded her, but remained just beyond her reach until now. Montana in autumn paints the world in amber and gold, a landscape of transition where summer's green retreats before winter's approaching stillness. 6 months had passed since the surgery in Seattle. 6 months of healing, of adaptation, of learning to navigate a world transformed by both loss and newfound ability. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling fields of wheat as Ivy Mulberry walked slowly along the edge of the property that was now legally hers. She wore a light jacket against the early morning chill, and her small fingers traced the tops of the wheat stalks, feeling their gentle resistance. The hearing aid in her ear, more advanced than the hospital's temporary model, captured the whisper of the breeze through the grain, a sound she was still learning to identify and cherish. Behind her walked Crystal, whose transformation had continued long after leaving the hospital. Gone were the carefully calculated outfits and camera-ready makeup. Instead, she wore practical jeans and boots suited to farm life, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple braid. The phone that had once been permanently attached to her hand now remained mostly in her pocket, used for practical purposes rather than constant documentation. "It's so beautiful here," Crystal said, her gaze sweeping across the vast Montana sky. "I never knew places like this still existed," Ivy smiled, both hearing the words and reading Crystal's lips, a combination of skills she had been developing with remarkable speed. "Grandpa always said this land has its own heartbeat," she replied, her spoken voice still carrying the distinctive cadence of someone who had learned to speak without being able to hear herself. "I can feel it under my feet." They continued walking until they reached a solitary tree standing sentinel at the edge of the property. Beneath it stood a simple stone marker, recently placed. Ivy approached it with measured steps, the small straw hat she carried clutched tightly in her hands. It was too big for her, meant for an adult's head, but she had refused to leave it behind today. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Crystal asked gently. Ivy nodded, her young face showing a determination beyond her years. She placed the straw hat atop the marker, weighting it down with a small stone to prevent the wind from carrying it away. Embroidered on the hat's band was the same phrase that had once fallen from Edgar's original hat in the Denver airport. "Paid with my soul. Just let my granddaughter live." The stone marker read simply, "Edgar Mulberry, 1958-2024, Heart of the Earth." Crystal stood back respectfully as Ivy knelt beside the marker. The little girl placed her palm flat against the cool stone, her eyes closing as if trying to feel some connection to the man, whose heart now partially beat within her chest. "I can hear the birds now, Grandpa," she whispered, "just like you wanted." The wind picked up, rustling through the wheat fields in what almost sounded like a response. Back at the farmhouse, a sturdy structure built in the 1930s and lovingly maintained through the decades, Nurse Helen Patel waited on the porch, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. She had taken a leave of absence from Seattle Children's Hospital to help with Ivy's transition, But that arrangement had gradually evolved into something more permanent. The rural Montana community desperately needed medical professionals, and Helen had found an unexpected peace in this open landscape so different from the urban hospital corridors where she had spent her career. As Ivy and Crystal returned from the marker, Helen noticed the girl was carrying something she hadn't taken with her, a small wildflower that had somehow managed to bloom near the stone. "Ready for your checkup?" Helen asked with a warm smile. Ivy nodded, placing the flower carefully in a glass of water before following Helen to the makeshift examination area they had set up in what was once Edgar's study. The walls were still lined with agricultural reference books and old photographs, a legacy of knowledge about the land that would someday be Ivy's to claim. Helen went through the now familiar routine, checking Ivy's heart rate, blood pressure, and the healing incision on her chest. The scar was fading to a thin silvery line, but it would always remain, a visible testament to the connection between grandfather and granddaughter that transcended normal family bonds. "Everything sounds perfect," Helen said, removing her stethoscope. "Your heart is strong." Ivy's hand moved to her chest, pressing gently over the place where part of Edgar's heart valve now resided within her own. "It's his heart too," she said softly. "That's why it's strong." In the kitchen, Crystal was preparing lunch, a skill she had never bothered to learn in her previous life of takeout meals and catered events. Now she moved with growing confidence, chopping vegetables for a hearty soup that would ward off the autumn chill. Her phone lay untouched on the counter, though occasionally it would buzz with notifications from her drastically transformed social media presence. After the events in Seattle, Crystal had deleted all her previous content and begun documenting a very different journey. The story of a little girl learning to hear the world for the first time, and the grandfather who had given everything to make it possible. The account had fewer followers now, but generated something far more valuable than superficial engagement: actual impact. The fundraiser she had started for pediatric hearing aids had already exceeded its goal 3 times over. As the three sat down to lunch, the conversation flowed easily between them. This unlikely family formed through circumstance and choice rather than blood. Helen shared news from the hospital in Seattle, where Dr. Chen was pioneering a refined version of the procedure that had saved Ivy, making it safer for future donors. Crystal talked about the farm's finances, which she had taken upon herself to manage with unexpected aptitude. And Ivy, speaking and signing simultaneously from long habit, described the new sounds she had discovered that morning. A woodpecker tapping in the distance, the different tones of the wind depending on what it passed through. What none of them mentioned was the confidential medical report that had arrived the previous week, securely tucked away in Helen's personal files. It contained information that fundamentally changed the narrative they had all accepted. Edgar had not, as they had believed, donated his entire heart valve. The groundbreaking procedure had instead transplanted a functional portion of the tissue through an experimental approach that had been hastily approved for emergency use. The technical details were complex, but the implications were simple. Edgar could have survived, should have survived. What the report couldn't explain was why he had disappeared from the hospital during his recovery, checking himself out against medical advice once he was strong enough to walk. The surveillance cameras had caught him leaving through a side entrance, moving slowly but determinedly, a new hat pulled low over his eyes. No credit card transactions, no phone calls, no digital footprint had been detected since that day. It was as if Edgar Mulberry had simply chosen to vanish. The stone marker beneath the tree was symbolic, a place for Ivy to connect with the grandfather she believed she had lost. Whether he was truly gone or simply gone from their lives remained one of those mysteries that sometimes resisted resolution. After lunch, as Crystal and Helen cleaned up, Ivy slipped outside again, drawn to the porch where she could watch the sun begin its descent toward the distant mountains. She removed her hearing aid for a moment, returning to the silence that had been her world for so many years. In that familiar quietude, she could almost feel Edgar's presence more strongly, as if some connections existed beyond sound, beyond sight, beyond all ordinary senses. She replaced the hearing aid after a few minutes, welcoming back the gentle symphony of the farm, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through wheat, the rustle of leaves preparing to fall. Sounds that would forever remind her of the man who had made them accessible to her, at a cost only he fully understood. In the distant tree line, a figure watched the farmhouse for a long moment, before turning away. The man adjusted his new hat, different from the old one but still capable of hiding his face from casual observation. Then he continued his solitary journey, disappearing among the golden wheat stalks that stretched toward the horizon like an ocean of light. Behind him, seated on the porch of the home he had ensured would always be hers, Ivy suddenly turned her head, as if catching a sound just at the edge of perception, something familiar yet impossible to name. A presence rather than a noise, a connection that no distance could sever. Edgar Mulberry's journey reminds us that true wealth isn't measured by private jets or first-class tickets, but by what we're willing to sacrifice for those we love. In a world quick to judge on appearances, he showed us that redemption often comes not through grand gestures visible to all, but through quiet acts of sacrifice known only to a few. What would you give up to right the wrongs of your past? How far would you go to ensure someone you love gets the chance you denied another? The most powerful legacy isn't what we leave behind in possessions or property, but what continues to live and grow within others. Edgar gave more than land to Ivy. He gave her the ability to hear birds sing, the chance to experience a world previously closed to her, and most literally, a piece of his own heart. In your life, are you building monuments to yourself, or are you planting seeds that will grow long after you're gone? If this story touched your heart, remember that second chances don't always announce themselves. They often arrive disguised as difficult choices, painful sacrifices, or moments of humility. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to change a life, including your own. Follow our channel for more stories that reveal the extraordinary courage of ordinary people, and leave a comment about what this story taught you. Because sometimes, the most important journeys begin when we're thrown out of places we never belonged in the first place.